Hey there, YouTube. I'm Jesse Tovar. For today's My Place Cafe Afternoon Prose reading, we have Jo Kaplan, author of When the Night Bells Ring and It Will Just Be Us. Cap- Kaplan is featured in other frightening themed anthologies. Last month, she read at Village Well, where I bought a book there by Brian Swain Wallace. I'm actually happy that Kaplan is here because I reached out to her about today after Glendale College's English Tea event. That event was about English majors who have earned their bachelor's and master's degrees after transferring from community colleges like me, discussing their experiences working towards the degrees. I'm always ecstatic when I receive ARCs, especially to prepare for events like this. While reading When the Night Bells Ring, Old Town Road played in my head a few times. Chapters in When the Night Bells Ring are split between Lavina's diary and a bleak future where ACs are hoarded and water is extremely scarce. Lavina's diary is realist literature that exists in what English studies classifies as the in-between of American romanticism and naturalism. The commonality that is evident early on is that Lavina's group parts ways from their larger group referred to as the company, and that Winoka and Mads part ways from the greater community that chooses to stay in the evacuation center. Some would think that the cool thing about When the Night Bells Ring is that they get two books in one. Whenever the characters think of the events described in Lavina's diary, the diary serves as some sort of like medicine for a living nightmare. By the way, there's actually a bookstore in San Francisco called Medicine for Nightmares. Yeah, so you should check that out if you guys get a chance. Reading the diary while making observations of their surroundings made them feel superstitious. An example of superstition is in this excerpt. Part of Winoka wanted to tear down the bell from where it hung, its very presence seeming to invoke whatever had plagued the town of Virgil back in the 1860s. But another part of her, the part that hissed in the shadows of her mind, feared if she took it down, it would have no way of knowing if the phantoms were approaching. She laughed at herself to relieve some of the attention. Another part I found endearing in this novel is when Lavinia said the following to her daughter: "No matter how far I go, I will hear it, and I will come hurrying back to you. This bell has its own unique voice that I will recognize. That way, a cat recognizes the meow of her kittens. No matter why the bell rings, I will come back for you." Another excerpt that stands out to me is this, and this is, I guess, in reference to Winoka. She aimed the light down at her feet and saw just ahead of her a strange murky reflection: water. At first, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She couldn't move. She stood frozen with the light on the surface of the muddy sump. Then a cry ripped from her throat, a cry of desperate joy, and she surged forward until she was up to her ankles in the icy water. She dropped it to her knees and splashed it on her face, the shock of the cold and wet hitting her like a slap. Her body leaned forward irresistibly, wanting to drink, to open her mouth and lap it up. But some latent caution, buried like a nugget of wisdom, reminded her that she had to boil it first. Could she wait that long? Once Winoka and Mads find water, their excitement makes me think about people in some countries who must line up to collect their allotment of water for the week of the month. I also think about how in the city of LA, which just was mentioned in the news like a couple months back, where you can collect recycled water for lawns when you take specialized classes and bring your own watertight lid containers to the reclamation plant. When I heard that on the news while reading this novel, I did get concerned that this could be a sign that this novel's prediction to a future that could soon be upon us, where we all have to just like we all, if we want to drive a car, go get a license and whatnot. We all have to be licensed just to collect our allotment of water. So with that said, please welcome Jo Kaplan.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I have a couple of short sections that I wanted to read from the novel. And thank you, Jesse, for that introduction and for pointing out some of those passages. Even hearing them read reminded me of those moments. And it's just always nice to hear the words come to life in somebody else's mouth, other than my own. So I have two sections, actually, that I wanted to read today, one from each timeline of the book. So he mentioned it's kind of two books in one. There's the two timelines, one in the near future and one in the 1860s, which is told through Lavinia's diary. So to get a taste of both of these timelines in the book, I have a section from each one that I wanted to read that sort of captures some of the key elements that are going on in these two different timelines and introduces us a bit to the characters and also to the bells, the eponymous bells mentioned in the title, when the night bells ring. So I'm going to start with a section from Lavinia's diary. She and her family have just arrived in Virgil, Nevada, a mining town, and they're kind of just getting their bearings, figuring out what the town is like, meeting people, and that's kind of where we meet them at the beginning of this section. So much of our nourishment is dried and salted, we elected to trudge into town and assess what victuals are to be had in the grocery store. I was plumb delighted to find Sophie hungry for once, and thought her hard knocks must be at an end. Oscar dashed about ahead of us, kicking a rock across the ground, while Sophie held my hand primly. "Mama," she said to me as we passed onto Main Street, "why are there bells on all the doorways?" Indeed, she was right. I had not noticed it before, but it is just as she said. As soon as I saw them, I could not imagine how I had missed them. Little silver bells hanging not just from the doorways of the shops, the boarding house, the post office, the two-story stone courthouse, but also from the doorway of each cabin and residence we had passed. Every last building had a bell over its entrance. Why this should disconcert me so, I cannot say. On the edge of town, rugged hills and mountains carve up the pale, dusty sky. One can see the buildings of the mine from here, it is so close. It is, after all, the town's lifeblood. Virgil would not exist without the Virgil Consolidated Mining Company. And out beyond the edges of Virgil loom strange rocky hills, toxic plants, and evil cacti. Nothing here is familiar. Indeed, Virgil seems to be a lone outpost amid a vast wilderness. I suppose the bells are so that they can hear when someone is coming, yet it seems strange to me why there should be one on every building. Perhaps the people here do not like to be caught unawares. Sophie asked me if we would put a bell on our door as well, gazing up at me with those eyes of deepest blue, wide and guileless. I do not think I would like having a bell on our door, jangling intrusively every time one of us goes in or out. It seems a dreadful intrusion on the quiet. Claudia will know what it means. I must ask her of the bells, why they are there, though I fear I may encounter her reticence once again. September 6th, 1869. Today I secured us a goat and 2 sheep. I attempted also to identify what sort of crops might grow on our land, only to be stymied by the grocer's laughter. "All hardpan out there," he said. "You won't get naught but weeds." Even the sheep seem resentful of the lack of good eating. Their eyes seem to accuse me so. If only I could explain to them in a language they might understand that we are all making the best of things. Perhaps my stroking puts them at ease. I often find the company of animals a balm unlike any other, a contentment one simply cannot find among people. Animals have an utter honesty and sincerity about them. They are incapable of the lies and manipulations that contaminate human society. It is too late in the season, besides, to do much planting. Winter will be upon us in short order. Yet the days remain hot even now, as in the thick of summer, and excessive dry. There is but little rain and nary a cloud to blot out the overbearing sun. By this time of year, Boston would be cool and rainy, the air ripe with the soft moisture of the sea. I filled my bucket with water from the pump outside of the grocery store, and my arms strained as I lumbered back down the street with it, as well as the sack of feed thrown over my shoulder. Others were about, and I heard hushed conversation as I passed. Perhaps they did not know I could hear them. "Help the poor girl out," said one. "That's one of the new ones, the Canes," said his companion, and they turned away from me. I lowered the bucket and set myself down for a spell, the sun hot on my back like all fire. I swatted flies from the sweetness of my sweat. I felt alone as a body can feel. It was just as if the other people about town were only flies buzzing away from me. It reminds me of Boston, in the latter days of our shame, when we had become pariahs. If it had only been the bucket or the feed, I wouldn't have had such trouble, and perhaps I ought to have made 2 trips after all. But now that I had both, I was determined to get them back to the cabin, and as I was all on my own, it was a double burden upon me. Just as I was beginning to gather myself to continue, I found that I was inside of the boarding house, and I wondered if Claudia was in. It took me another few minutes to bring myself to its porch, not because the way was so very far, but because I was continually and stubbornly convincing myself that it was more prudent to simply continue home. Yet the notion of a brief respite from the toil, to call on the one person in town who has shown me an ounce of kindness, seemed to me a merry prospect. So I set down my bucket and feed on the porch and went inside. The parlor was more lushly appointed than the building's exterior suggested. There sat a scrolled velvet sofa against elegantly patterned wallpaper, which appeared in a French style to my unworldly eyes. 2 young women in scandalously little clothing sat there with drinks in hand. Behind a counter stood the woman I took to be Miss Rosemary Shaw. So used to plainness, I was quite struck by this woman, who I can only describe as adorned. Fur on her shoulders, a pair of minuscule spectacles on her delicate nose, a feathered hat on her silver curls, striking jade earrings dangling from her ears. Though heavy-set and imposing, she was nevertheless a handsome woman. She turned to me on my arrival and appraised me quickly, then said, "Looking for work? Don't worry, dear. There are so many men in this town and so few women. No one will bat an eye at those homely looks." I told her I was only looking for Claudia. "Bernadette," Miss Shaw snapped at one of the girls lounging on the sofa. "Up with you. Go and retrieve her." Miss Shaw's keen eyes turned sideways to me as the girl leapt from the couch and bounded up the narrow staircase. "You're lucky we're slow this time of day. Claudia is quite popular." She came down just as lovely as ever, wearing a plain white gown. Her hair was pinned up today with loose curls hanging around her rouged face. She seemed surprised to see me here. Miss Shaw went off somewhere else, and Bernadette returned to her companion on the sofa, who had been holding her drink. With a tilt of her head, Claudia indicated that we had better step out onto the porch, so we did. My bucket and bag of feed became quite apparent at our feet, so I told her I had stopped for a short rest before carrying my burdens the 3 miles back, and had desired to thank her for bringing me to Emery's cabin. She glanced behind her, though we had shut the door on our way out, then looked back at me and said, "Let me help you." I attempted to decline. It would be far too generous of her to help me all the way back to the cabin, but she told me she was not busy right now and would very much enjoy a walk out of doors. So Claudia took the sack of feed while I hefted the bucket, and slowly we made our way down the dusty road. There was nothing to do but talk as we went. I didn't want to trouble her or frighten her off, so I did not ask her again about what happened to Emery, though I very much wanted to. To my delight, after correcting my pronunciation of her name, she taught me a few Spanish words. Let me see if I can remember them. Mantequilla is butter. Gracias is thank you. Amor is love. She offered to teach me more if I ever came round again. The walk was so much pleasanter with Claudia beside me, sharing the load. The cabin lay not far ahead of us when the distinct jingle of a bell shrilled nearby, as a woman exited her home with a bundle of washing. I couldn't help myself. "May I ask, why are there all these bells?" She said the most peculiar thing. "The bells are so that we can hear when the spirits are approaching. When you hear the bells at night, you know los fantasmas are about." This must be the quaint superstition of the town. It reminds me of those awful stories I have heard about poor souls who are inadvertently buried alive. How some will install bells above the grave with a string that goes down to the coffin, so that if one awakens to find himself wrongly interred, he may tug on the string to ring the bell and signal whoever might hear. The thought sends a horrible shiver all through me. How awful, the notion of waking in the dark of a little coffin, closed in by 6 feet of dirt, hoping that someone will hear your ringing before you truly perish. Oh, thank you. So like I said, that was from Lavinia's diary and kind of just gives us a little sense of how her strange introduction to this town and its peculiar ways. She mentions Emery's cabin, That is her brother-in-law who had gone missing in this town, and it was kind of why she and her husband decided to take their family here. Although they had other reasons involving her husband's work, uh, basically as a snake oil salesman. And when he was found out as trying to sell garbage, they ended up leaving where they were living and going across the country to this town in Nevada. But when they get there, her brother-in-law Emery is nowhere to be found, and they can't seem to figure out where he went. None of the townspeople will tell them, but they do end up at his cabin. So that is where they end up staying, and that is, of course, where she is when they go around and start seeing all these bells, which tell us that the spirits are out at night when you hear them ring. So I have one more section that I wanted to read, and this is from the other timeline now. So we have new characters, a different time period, but still the same location, more or less. So these characters are a pair of climate refugees who left Los Angeles because climate change has wreaked havoc on the area. It's no longer really inhabitable. There have been wildfires. This girl, Waynoka, her apartment burned down, so she has nowhere to live. She finds this other woman, Mads, and together they decide to go off on a cross-country road trip, basically, to find some place in the east of the U.S. that has water. But of course, in order to get there, they have to travel through this vast desert, which, like Death Valley and the Mojave Desert. So they pass through Nevada and they find this ghost town. And the ghost town is Virgil. And they decide that there must be water somewhere in the mine because many mines, they'll be flooded in the lower levels. So they think, last ditch effort to get something to drink. Let's go into this mine and try to find some water that we can boil to get rid of the toxins and we can drink. So they go into this mine, which is where they find Lavinia's diary. And Waynoka has been reading the diary, and she's reading these stories about the bells and ghosts at night, and she's kind of freaking herself out a little bit. In addition to the fact that they are sort of trapped in this mine at this point, there's no easy way for them to get out. Mads has been injured in a fall, and so she's pretty freaked out at this point in the story. They're in this little room, this like chamber that they found in the mine, which is where they found Lavinia's diary, and they've been just sort of hunkered down there for the time being. Now in this little room, there is, there's an arched doorway, sort of, that leads out to a deeper tunnel into the mine. And above that doorway, there's a bell. So that's where we're gonna start. A spasm of sound, sharp, metallic, echoing, threw Waynoka's heart into a lurch. The bell's peal crashed through her sleep and flushed her cold, awake. Her eyes sprang open as the bell slowed to a gentle sway against the black entrance. Something had disturbed it. She hadn't even realized she'd fallen asleep, the diary open on her chest. A red-tinged light was fading. The fire in its death throes burnt to embers. She stared into the darkness as the bell went still, willing herself to go long intervals between blinks. Something had made the bell ring. She thought of the man who had died in Lavinia's time, and her heart lurched again. That ache bloomed into a swell of panic, which she forced down like a rising gorge. Panic would not help this far below the earth. But panic had followed her down the broken ladder into this warren of narrow tunnels, where the darkness closed in like the tightening of her own throat as she tried to remember to breathe. With a quick crank to give it a little burst of juice, she aimed the flashlight into the tunnel. The bell flashed and the walls turned white as they receded into nothing. Trembling, Waynoka convinced herself to step toward the entrance and then through it. 20 steps in, her beam of light stuttered. She hurried to wind the flashlight as its flicker caught something moving or turning, caught what looked like two gleaming black marbles that made Waynoka think eyes. But by the time the light steadied, there was nothing there except for a dark lump on the ground. Cautiously, she drew closer, not understanding the shape, which she realized was distorted by the long shadow the flashlight threw behind it. When she recognized the shadow, she understood she was looking at a dead bat. She looked behind her at the bell, which by now had fallen still. Could the bat have rattled it when flying through the tunnel? And then it dropped dead all of a sudden? What, had the ringing given the bat a heart attack? She drew the flashlight beam back toward the bat, and then all around, training it on the crevices in the walls to be sure there was nothing else here, nothing with black marble eyes. When she felt she had been as thorough as possible, she returned to the little room and watched the dwindling embers, trying to convince herself of the plausibility of the bat heart attack narrative. She considered rousing Mads, but thought better of it. Her knee had swollen a grisly eggplant purple through the rips in her jeans, clotted blood turning black. Wainoka winced just looking at it, and then winced again when the throbbing in her own head intensified. She missed pills. Ibuprofen, acetaminophen, aspirin, the stuff of gods. That warm rush as a headache magically receded after a couple of Advil, or when an extra strength Tylenol suddenly took the edge off a stomach churning bout of menstrual cramps. Mads would have to do without painkillers for the knee. Wainoka thought about Lavinia Kane, who knew no pharmaceuticals. What did she do when she had cramps? Toughed it out, Wainoka guessed, the way they had to do now as well. Nothing but a rag and a lack of sympathy. What a waste of suffering. And for what? Her heart by now had slowed to a calmer rhythm. She kept the flashlight aimed at the tunnel entrance, presided over by the painted ochre figure and the mercifully still bell. So much of history, and all its advancements, was about the alleviation of suffering, no matter the cost to the world around them, as if they had forgotten that humans were a part of that world, as if they could divorce their own suffering from everything else. What was it her grandfather had once told her? When the air suffers, the ground suffers. When the ground suffers, the trees suffer. When the trees suffer, the birds and the squirrels suffer. And when the birds and the squirrels suffer, so do we. Why birds and squirrels? He had never said. But by now she thought she knew why the air suffered in the first place. Smoke burned her eyes and sent needles into her lungs. They were lucky they hadn't asphyxiated themselves. That meant there was enough ventilation, which might mean there were other ways out of the mine nearby. But it wouldn't do to relight the fire now and risk breathing in more tainted air, the kind of air that made her throat a rusty pipe. And even if there was a ventilation shaft nearby, who was to say they had any means of climbing it? Who was to say they could make use of it at all, except to shout impotently up into nothing, into the emptiness where no one would hear them? It reminded her of those Chilean miners years ago, who famously had been trapped in the darkness for, 2 months? Except here the world wasn't watching. Here, no one knew or cared who they were or why they were in this long disused and dangerously forgotten mine. Here, no one was coming to help. They were on their own, and those are the ones you never hear about. You hear about the boys' soccer team trapped in a flooded cave in Thailand because of the daring rescue, the various nations that pulled together to send elite teams swimming down flooded tunnels. You hear about the resourceful ones too. The rock climber who sawed off his own arm after being trapped in a narrow fissure, who survived through his own stubbornness, to have a movie made about him. You don't hear about the ones no one comes to save or who can't save themselves, the ones who disappear in the desert, never to be heard from again. Wainoka moved the flashlight around the room, livid shadows twitching in its wake, as if the room all around her was alive and crawling just outside the focus of her being. Her skin crawled in response. Lavinia had been down here at some point. There was nothing to indicate she died here. No body, no bones. That must be proof there was another way out. Wainoka wondered how long it took for bones to turn to dust. Her eyes danced around the chamber, sharpening on the grit that lined the floor, waiting to spot a tooth or some other telltale sign of death. But there was nothing. Nothing in here, at least. How long had it taken those prospectors to dig out this vast labyrinth? All that work for a bit of gold and silver. Even if it meant burying themselves in earth, digging their own tombs, trapping themselves away from light and life, all for some useless silver. Gold hadn't stopped the drought's desiccation from turning green plants to dead sheaves of kindling. Gold hadn't stopped the fires from scorching the hillsides and filling the sky with blue smoke, filling the blue sky with smoke. Nor had it stopped the wave of newly unhoused from dying of heat stroke when summer hit hard and long, or the riots that followed, or the empty grocery store shelves when the supply chain broke down. The rich and powerful threw obscene sums of money at the problem, but it didn't stop any of that from happening. Wainoka stared at the dangling bell. Her ears strained to make out any hint of sound in the abyssal chasm beyond it. Did she hear a scrape? Maybe like a pickaxe dragged against stone? It was too indistinct to make out its sharp edges. Or maybe she was only imagining it. She couldn't tell. But she stared at the bell, a silver beacon against a void, and she hoped the bat had had a heart attack. Thank you.
All right, so what I'm gonna do is I actually have a few questions in here, but
Okay.
to ask, I'm gonna and then I'll pass it on to you guys to see like if you guys have any questions to ask. Let's see here. I think I wrote a question in regards to this section when you mentioned the miners. So let me see if I can find that question here. I think. Oh, you know what? I think it was more like a no. But anyways, let's see. I think which question am I gonna ask here? Okay, one question I do want to ask, and since you read like one section from the diary and one section from like the journey of like Kona and Mads, is as Mads and Winoka explore the cave, Mads finds comfort in learning Sophie was getting better after being ill for quite some time. Why does literature comfort provide comfort to those who are in a state of unknown? I hope I made sense.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that a lot of us turn to storytelling for many reasons, but it is there's something comforting about being able to read somebody else's story, especially if somebody else's story shows them going through, struggle or trauma and then coming out the other side.
Yeah.
It's like a vicarious catharsis, I think, for us when we see somebody else go through probably something worse than what we've personally experienced. I've never been trapped in a mine, thank goodness.
Yeah.
But and I can't speak to. I won't speak to what happens to them at the end because that would be a spoiler. But
Right.
but yeah, when we read other people's stories and see them come out the other end of like severe trouble or trauma, I think there is something comforting about that in the sense that we can also overcome whatever it is we're dealing with. And I also think that's why people like horror. One of the reasons people like horror is because we get to vicariously experience these terrible things, and kind of also experience that catharsis that comes out the other end of it.
Yeah, and I now just found the question about the where you name drop like 33 and the
Oh yeah.
and the Thai miners, but you're kind of already answered that question, so that's pretty good. So let's see here. I'll ask one more question actually, and before I pass it on to those that are here. Let's see. Okay, you world build a desert where the land is dry to the point where the texture of the dirt and sand has drastically changed. The narrator states in the beginning of the book, they waited until the sun gave up the ghost so they could sit a while and watch the stars come out before they continued on their way. Why is it that people in this wasteland with ghost town conditions are so eager for the evening to arrive?
Mm. So I would say that's just a simple fact of rising global temperatures.
Mhm.
So already, I mean, we see temperatures. I mean, I guess if you go out to like the Mojave Desert and stuff, I mean, that could get up to like 115, 120.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
So basically, this is a very near climate change future, where these issues are basically just amped up.
Mhm.
Issues we're already experiencing are amped up to 10. So during the day, if they tried to travel during the day through the desert, it would be just way too hot. The sun is baking down on them. There's no reprieve from that. So basically, they have decided to only travel at night when the temperature does still drop and it's cooler. So yeah, so a lot of their activity takes place at night, and then they just kind of burrow under like solar blankets during the day.
Sure. All right, so now I'm gonna pass it on to you guys. Is there any questions you guys have for regarding this novel or anything that she's read for the two excerpts she's read so far today, or any just comments about like the reading
A comment I
or the
had.
book? Yeah.
Thank you. So a comment I had was, I thought it was interesting, you were saying the part about the thoughts about how many things happen that don't get reported or things that, like all the good and bad things, tragedies, victories that nobody knows about. So I think that's why the stories matter, I guess. I feel like that's what stuck out when we read that part. Was, I think that's the comfort of it, is it helps give some voice to all the times that's a fear. I can relate to that fear of like, I'm here, nobody's gonna know this happened.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's like not existing.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does, and I'm really glad you pointed that out because that is actually a theme that comes up again in the book. You know, she mentions in that moment, like, well, nobody knows that we're here, our story won't get told, but there's also like another thread that runs through where Wainoka back in LA wanted to be a screenwriter. She wanted to like tell stories. She never quite managed to actually get into that. So one of the things that Mads and Wainoka kind of tell each other to keep themselves going in this fairly hopeless situation is, once we get out of here, you'll write the movie of our experience, right? You'll write the screenplay
I remember that part.
about these two women who got stuck in this mine and made it out. And so they're like, we have to get out so I can write the screenplay. But that's also a source of hope and comfort. You know, the idea that I can get out, I can tell my story, I can share. And we are really drawn to those stories, like in the real life ones too.
Yeah.
I deliberately mentioned, you know, the 33, the miners, the Thai soccer team,
yeah.
and the 127 hours guy.
Oh yeah.
I mean, because they're all such intense stories of survival.
Right.
But again, we tend to see the stories of survival, but there might be so many other stories of tragedy of people getting lost, and we don't get to hear those stories because who's around left to voice them. So yeah, I think that question of who gets to have their story told is interesting, and also reading Lavinia's diary is another way of, you know, Wainoka feels this profound sense of she is getting to experience Lavinia's story in a way that probably nobody else has. Nobody else has read this diary before. So she ends up feeling a pretty strong connection with her in that way. She kind of gets sucked into it, and Mads almost has to like prod her and be like, come back to the real world.
For sure.
Thank you. Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions or any comments?
What was that?
Where can we get books?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. So that's a very important question. In terms of like local bookstores, there should be still a bunch of signed copies at Dark Delicacies in Burbank. I believe there should also be some copies at Romans in Pasadena. Because I know somebody who had told me that they were getting some copies in there. In terms of other places you can find it, you know, the typical internet, Amazon. You can go on barnesandnoble.com. I haven't seen any in store in Barnes and Nobles around here, but you know, you can get it on the website, and yeah.
Nice, great.
What was the name of that bookstore in Burbank? Dark Delicacies. It is a wonderful bookstore. It is a horror-themed bookstore. So all their stuff is horror. It's fantastic. I did a signing there a few weeks ago. So I think they still have stock because I signed a whole bunch of copies there. But yes, I recommend just going and checking out that bookstore no matter what because it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it does sound like a lot of fun.
Yeah,
Actually.
it's a great
It's a
store.
good area.
It's not
Mhm.
just
Yeah, it's not just books too. They have collectibles, they have DVDs, poster, like signed movie posters and stuff. Yeah, it's a great place.
Well, it's interesting to apply horror to something that's really not that, like usually when I hear horror, I'm thinking, you know, the images that come to mind are different than it's just, other than something that's like not that far fetched, like that we're kind of not that far away from,
Yeah.
you know, it's just, that's interesting. It's not that crazy, you know, to get to where you're describing, you know, and it's kind of sad that's.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, when I've told people, oh, it's like set in a future climate change world, sometimes people are like, isn't that basically where we are now?
Even like tomorrow.
Yeah, that's why I say it's very near future, you know, like 2 years from now.
No, but that's what I like about your book. Like I was saying earlier, like it just points out to like how worse it can get. You know what I mean? And that's why I brought up and thought about like that whole story about like learning how to collect water in containers. Is like I just hope we don't really get to that point because that does
Yeah.
sound a bit tedious. But who knows?
Yeah, and Waynoka is kind of the character. It's like the sort of like the audience viewpoint character, or at
Right.
least I find her relatable because she's a girl who has lived in cities and stuff. She's used to modern conveniences. She doesn't know how to survive, and that's kind of why she hooks up with Mads, who's a bit older, a bit more resourceful, has kind of been out on her own, sort of living off the grid almost for a little while anyway. And so Waynoka is kind of relying on her because I, like Waynoka, would also be like, what am I supposed to do
Yeah.
if we don't have like infrastructure and civilization? How do you survive? So she definitely relies on Mads, but also wants to be self-sufficient.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I think that's kind of a tug and pull at her own character is this reliance on Mads, the desire to be self-sufficient, and then also what happens when Mads gets injured, and she sort of Waynoka has to kind of take charge and figure out what to do from there.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for reading here today. I'm glad this is now reality, and thank you for giving me a chance to like host you to do a reading. I want to thank Latanya, of course, for my Place Cafe for allowing me to like put all these readings together for this past year. And thank you to you guys for coming out to see this reading. And we just want to say to those that are on YouTube, enjoy the rest of your weekend and enjoy the rest of the month. Take care.
Thank you, Jeff.